while I'm self-published, I don't often send stuff out for submission, and it's kind of cool not to get a rejection letter to go with the ones that I collected years ago when I wrote my first book. So this story, this might be a kind of a spectacle here, because when I read over this morning, I'm making corrections because this is getting published late next week. So you'll see me stumble over where I've made marks on here. And I realized this is more autobiographical than I thought it was going to be, and I'm like, got blubbery at the end, so it might be lack of sleep or being away from my wife for a few days, but if I'm like a big, tearful mess, you guys can just walk out. Sorry for me. So, this is called The Walk Up Nameless Ridge, and when I was thinking about this story, if we ever get to where we're settling more planets, all of a sudden, whatever boundaries we've set here are going to change. The gravity's different, if the mountains are bigger, the subject of this story, all of a sudden climbing up Mount Everest doesn't put you on the top of the heap anymore. Now there's another metric to measure yourself up to. So this is an alpining story, and it's science fiction, and I hope you enjoy it. The Walk Up Nameless Ridge. It was difficult to sleep at night, wishing good men dead. This was but one of the hurtful things I felt in my bones and wished I could ignore. It was an ugly truth waving its arms that I turned my gaze from, that I didn't like to admit even to myself. But while my bag warned me with the last of its power and my breath spilled out in white plumes toward the roof of our tent, while the flicker of the whisper stove melted snow for midnight tea, I lay in that dead zone above 60,000 feet and hoped not just for the failure of those above me, but that no man summoned and lived to tell the tale, not before I had my chance. It was a shameful admission, one I nearly raised with Hanson, my tent mate, to see in the wrinkles of his snow-beat face whether this was a guilt shared. I suspected it was. In the mess tents and around the yellow craters we dubbed latrines, the look among us was that only one would be remembered. The rest would die alone in the snow or live a life long forgotten, and not one of us would have been able to explain the difference to a child. Frozen to death by altitude or by time was all the same. The truth was this: history remembers the first and only the first. These are the creeping and eternal glaciers, the names etched across all time like scars in granite cliffs. Those who came after were the inch or two of snowdrift that would melt in due time. They would trickle forgotten into the pores of the earth, be swallowed, and melt snow at the feet of other forgotten men. It was 1/4 Eno's midnight and time to get up. If Schubert and Humphreys were to make it to the top, they likely would have by now. If any of their gear still worked, they'd be radioing in their victory, taking the first pictures of starlit peaks, wrinkling far past the limits of sight. By now, they would know how many fingers and toes it cost them, how much oxygen left in their tanks, whether or not they would live to speak of the mountain's conquest. The faint odor of tea penetrated my dark thoughts. It must have been a potent brew to smell it at all. We had already scaled beyond the heights where taste and scent fade into oblivion. One had to remind himself to eat and drink, for the stomach is one of those organs that knows when to quit. It is the first time to go. The mind of the climber is the last. Hanson brought me tea. I wormed a single arm out into the cold, though my heating bag had become a feeble thing. I did not want to lose what little it held. I coughed into my fist, that persistent cough of the dead zone, and accepted the steaming mug. There were no words spoken as we forced ourselves to drink. Every twitch was an effort at those altitudes. We were sleeping higher than all the fabled peaks of Sirius 7. Our fourth camp along the slopes and ridge at 42,880 feet was higher than any speck of dirt on Hanson's home planet. And when we arrived on this wasteland of a frozen ball out here in a corner of a galaxy where men go either to not be found or to be remembered for all times, we set up a base camp very near to the highest peak of the place I grew up, Earth, where men were first born and first began to scale to deadly heights. I sipped my tea, burning my numb lips, and told myself it would be an Earthborn who scaled Mount Mallory first. This was a distasteful idea that I and many others were willing to share. The secret I kept to myself was that others could die if they dared climb her before me. That's a scene break. 2 other private teams were making a go of it that season. Government expeditions and collectives of alpine clubs had given up decades ago. They now warily watched as men such as I took leave of our day jobs and with borrowed funds and the best of gear and medicine in hand, set out to prove what was possible. The window of opportunity for a summit was but a bare sliver of a crack. Half a day at most, when the fearful winds of that dizzy world slowed to a manageable gale, and before the monsoons buried the rock under drifts 100 meters deep. The problem, of course, was in not knowing when that half day would fall. Every climber across 13 worlds studied the weather charts like day traders. As the season neared, predictions were logged on the net. Men in their warm homes with their appetites intact and the feeling still in their fingers and toes would make guesses, watch reports from the satellites left behind by this government expedition, and make bold claims. I had been one of those prognosticators until recently. But now, after spending a night at Camp 7 beneath the Kimmer Ridge, I felt as though I had graduated to one who could sneer at the antics of those at lesser heights. By dint of my travel between the stars and my arduous climb thus far, I was now an expert. It lent Hansen and I the illusion that our guess was far more refined than the others. Or perhaps it was the lack of oxygen that made us crazy that way. In the middle of that terrible night, rather than spend my last morning thinking of my wife and kids or dwell further on the debts incurred to travel to frontier stars and hike up a murderous peak, I thought of all my fellow climbers who were safely ensconced in their homes as they followed our every move. Right now, they likely followed Schubert and Humphreys, 2 strong climbers who had knocked out all else the galaxy had to offer. They would also be keeping an eye on Hansen and I. And then there was the pairing of Ziva and Cardinal, who were also making a bid that year. Ziva was an enigma of a climber, a small woman who looked far too frail in her heat suit and mask. When first I saw her navigating the lower column ice falls above base camp, I mistook her oxygen tanks for double lots in size, such as they dwarfed her frame. The consensus was that there was little to fear in her attempt that year. I had done some digging before my uplink succumbed to the cold, and read that Ziva had knocked out the peaks of her home planet, none of which topped 30,000 feet. But she had at least done them in style. No oxygen, and swiftly, one of those modern climbers. It had been a private joy to watch her give in to the true mountaineering methods necessary on Mallory's great phase. The methodical lift of crampons, the bulging tanks of air, the fogging and frosted masks. These were the ways of the true climber. Mallory is an instructor to us all, and Ziva did not seem too full of herself to submit, learn, and adapt. Cardinal, I figured, was the great unknown. Ziva had chosen an odd tent mate in the android, and if it were a machine that was the first to summit Great Mallory, the consensus across the Alpine forums was that nothing would have occurred at all. There would not even be an accomplishment to asterisks. And anyway, I had sent notes a week ago to an old climbing buddy, telling him not to worry. The cold was worse on the machine's joints than our own. Hansen and I had left Camp 6 while Ziva was chipping away at Cardinal's frozen ankles. And please don't tell me that a man's memories accounted for the man himself, that the android lived because he remembered living. I had many a conversation with Cardinal around base camp and watched him with the Sherpas. He is no different than the droid who cleans my pool or walks my dog. A clever approximation, but with movements too precise, too clean to pass for human. The other day, Hansen nudged me in time to turn and watch Cardinal taking a great spill on the east face. The way he did even this was unnatural. Supremely calm and without a whimper, the Manchin had slid several hundred feet on his ass, working his climbing axe into the deep snow with all the false grace of an automaton. Nobody feared this duo as long as they were behind and below us. There, off our ropes and out of our way, they had only themselves to kill. For people who aren't into mountaineering, this is probably really boring right now. Hansen and I left our flapping tent in utter darkness. The driven snow blocked out all but a few of the twinkling stars. Near the tent, a pile of spent oxygen bottles gathered adrift. They glowed bright in Hansen's headlamp. Debris such as this would be left for all time. They were an addition to the landscape. The local Hajing, whose lands included half of Great Mallory, made good money selling permits to aspiring climbers, and this litter came with the riches. The south face of Mallory, which some climbers posited would make for an easier ascent, was governed by the irascible Hittite. Great climbers by all accounts, but miserable at governing. The only assaults on that face had been clandestine affairs, There had been some arrests over the years, but like many who come to Eno, hoping to etch their name in the history books, most simply disappeared. Hansen broke snow for the first hour, his head down in a stiff breeze. We had radios in our parkas, but rarely used them. Good tent mates had little need for words. Roped into one another, the union becomes symbiotic. You match paces, one staring at a flash-lit patch of bright snow, the other staring at a man's back, illuminating a spot in a sea of darkness. Boots fell into the rapidly filling holes of the climber ahead, each lifting of a crampon some new torture, even with the springs of the powder climbing pants taking most of the strain. I've lost count of the number of peaks we'd climbed together. It was in the dozens across a handful of planets, most of those climbs coming during the last 5 years. Climbers tend to orbit one another long before they share tents. The first time I met Hansen was back on Earth, on a new route of Nanga Parbat, a small mountain, but notorious for gobbling souls. Climbers called her Man-Eater, usually with knowing and nervous smiles. Tourists from other planets came to exercise on its west slope, or to make an attempt on its south face while preparing for harsher climbs. Some took the tram to Everest to hike up to the top, and joined the legions who made that yearly pilgrimage, only to walk away wondering what the fuss was about. I tended to bite my tongue during such diminishing talks of my planet's highest peak. My 20-year partnership with Saul, my previous tent mate, had ended on a harmless run up Everest. There was a saying among the Hitti Sherpas: ropes slip through relaxed grips. The nearest I ever came to death was while climbing indoors, of all things. It wasn't something I told anyone. Those few who had been there and the doctors who tended to me knew. When anyone noticed my limp, I told them it happened during my spill on Karshunga. I didn't say I'd failed to double back my harness and took a 40-foot spill on a climb whose holds had been color-coded for kids. Saul had also fallen prey to a relaxed grip. He had died while taking a leak on Everest's south col. It was hard to stomach, losing a good man and a great friend like that. Hansen, who trudged ahead of me, had lost his former tent mate in more glorious fashion the same year Saul died. And so mountains brought couples together like retirement homes. You look around, and what you have left is what you bed down with. Ours, then, was a marriage of attrition, but it worked. Our bond was our individual losses and our mutual anger at the peaks that had taken so much from us. As Hansen paused, exhausted, and I rounded him to break snow, I patted the old man on the back, the gesture silent with thick gloves and howling wind, but he bobbed his head in acknowledgement to let me know he was okay. I coughed a raspy rattle into my mask. We were all okay. And above us, the white plumes and airborne glitter of driven ice and snow hid the weight of glory. But it was easy to find. Up, always up, one more foot toward land that no man had ever seen and lived to tell about. It's another scene break. At 60,000 feet, the height of 2 Everests stacked on top of one another, man and machine alike tended to break down. We were at the limit of my regimen of steroids. The gears in my hiking pants could be heard grinding against one another, even over all that wind. And the grease smeared over the parts of my face not sheltered by the oxygen mask had hardened until it felt like plaster, like blistered and unfeeling skin. But to touch it and investigate it was to invite exposure and far worse. Batteries meant to last days would perish in hours up there. The cold was death for them. And so our suits gave up as we moved from the death zone to a land that begged for a name far more sinister. The power left in struggling batteries went to the pistons and gears, routed away from the heaters. Fingers and toes went first. They would grow numb, the blood would stop flowing through them, the flesh would necropsy and die right there on the bone. The Sherpa of Shangli had a saying: a man can count on 2 hands all the climbs he conquers, and that man conquers nothing. I always took this to mean the more we summit, the more we lose. Climbers were notorious for staring down bars at base camp, and lifted mugs, silently counting digits gone missing, making a measure of a man's worth by how far they pushed themselves. Saul had a different take on the Shangli saying. To the people who lived in the shadows of mountains, these were not things to conquer. To climb them was foolish, and who would think to do so? As much as I had loved Saul, he was always too politically correct for my taste. Breaking snow up that unnamed ridge, my mind turning to mush as supplemental oxygen and doped blood could only do so much, I felt the first pangs of doubt. My cough rattled inside my mask. My limbs felt like solid lead. 2 days prior at Camp 5, I had pushed myself beyond my abilities. Eating and drinking moved from inconvenient chores to something I dreaded. My weight was down. I hadn't been out of my clothes to see what I'd wasted away, just comforted myself instead on how much less I now had to lug to the top. The radio in my parka clicked with the sound of Hanson breathing. I waited a moment between arduous steps and listened for what he had to say. When the radio clicked off, I turned to check on him, my headlamp pointed at his chest so as not to blind him. Hanson was a strong climber, one of the strongest I'd ever seen. He had fallen back to the end of the rope that joined us, his breath clouding his mask. Lifting a hand a few inches from his thigh was all the wave he could muster. "Take your time," I told him, clicking the large switch on my belt. What I wanted to say was what the hell we thought we were doing. There, that 5,000 feet below us and 8 light years away, was the tallest peak ever climbed. We were moving into the thin air above the highest of heads. We would have been in outer space on some small planets, in orbit around others, and still we wanted to conquer more. The rope between us drooped as Hanson took a few laborious steps. I turned and broke snow, resigning myself to an extra hour at the head, an extra shift to give him more rest. It was hard to know what drove you once you passed the thresholds of all pain. Maybe it was the thought of Schubert and Humphreys somewhere above us, either in glory or buried in snow. Or maybe it was the fear that Ziva had gotten Cardhill's ankles sorted, and that they would begin their push later that morning. Or maybe it was the promise I'd made to myself after telling my wife and kids that I would be safe. I had told them that I wouldn't take chances, but I'd already promised myself something different. I would come home with that final ridge named after me, or I wouldn't come home at all. My altimeter died at 62,000 feet, even though the manufacturer sold these with a guarantee of 100,000. Such guarantees were bullshit gestures with no real-world testing. As I climbed, I composed the post I would make on the forums complaining of its failures. Had my remaining fingers been any kind of functional, I would have removed the strap from my arm to save the weight. Instead, I carried one more dead thing up with me. From then on, I had to guess how high I was by the hour. It was still dark, and we were probably at 63,100 feet when I stumbled across Humphreys. He wore an orange suit, the kind men with low confidence and a care for their mortal coil wore. It made them more easily found and more likely to be found, two very different things. I pointed out the snow-dusted form so Hanson wouldn't trip on him, but I didn't slow. Humphreys had died facing the summit, which meant he hadn't made it. Felt a mix of relief and guilt for the awful thoughts that held in my sleeping bag all night. Schubert, of course, was still out there. We could meet him stomping down in the dark, his eyes as bright as the handful of twinkling stars above, and whatever was driving Hanson and I upward would likely leak out our pores. Whatever glory I'd hoped to win would be spent in future days recounting my time on the same slopes as this other man. I would detail my ordeal up Schubert Ridge, a horrible name if ever there was one. I would write of his glory and bask in whatever shadows fell my way. These were my mad ruminations as I left his dead tent mate behind and crunched through that terrible snow 1,000 feet beneath the peak. A tug on my harness gave me pause. Hanson was flagging again, at the end of his rope and ours. I questioned what I was running on for Hanson to give out before me. I wondered if the doctors had worked some kind of special magic between the doping and the careful regimen of drugs. Perhaps the coils in my pants were holding up better than his. Hanson had skipped on his gears and had invested in more heat. I may be freezing to death, but I was still climbing. I saw the look on his face beyond the glare of my flashlight and the frost of his desperate breathing. And that look told me that this was as high as he would go. It was a look I'd only seen from him once before, but enough time from others to not need the radio. After a coughing fit, I jerked my thumb toward the summit. Hanson lifted his hand from his thigh and waved. As I pulled the quick release that held our rope to my harness, I wondered if I would be stepping over both him and Humphreys on my way back down. God, I hoped not. I watched him turn and trudge into the dark mauve night and white fang of snow before looking again to my goal. The summit was several more hours away. I would be the first or the second to stand there. Those were adjacent numbers and yet light years apart in my esteem. They were neighboring peaks with a precipitous valley shouldering them apart. Being second was death to me, so I lifted a boot, gears squealing, toes numb, and remembered with sadness the lies I had spoken to my family. There was nothing about this safe. If I loved them as much as I loved myself, I would have turned around long before Hansen had. The winds came for me and shoved my chest for being so bold. With my oxygen running low, the mask became an impediment to breathing, something to catch my coughs. Adjusting the top of the mask against my goggles, fingers frozen stiff, I let the wind howl through a crack, invigorating me with the cold. The gap sang like the sound a puff makes across the mouth of a bottle. This whirring howl was a sort of musical accompaniment. It made me feel less alone. The dwindling oxygen made me feel crazy. When I came across Schubert, I thought he was already dead. The snow was covering him, and the ridge here was perilously narrow. Solid rock stayed dusted with snow and ice, otherwise it felt the ridge itself should be blowing away. Schubert stirred as I made my slow and agonizing way around him. He was faintly swimming toward the summit, clawing through the ice, throwing his axe forward. I stopped and knelt by the young and powerful climber. His suit made no noise. It must have given out on him, leaving him alone and under his own power. My thoughts were as wild as the wind, disturbed by my air-starved mind. I thought of Carthill and how something so reliant on its mechanical bits held any hope for rising above Camp 7. I rested a hand on Schubert's back to let him know he wasn't alone. I don't know that he ever knew I was there. He was still crawling, inch by inch toward the summit, as I trudged along, head down, mask singing a sad lament. If I made the top and got home, I decided I would name that ridge after him. I was already dreaming not just of being a legend, but the awesome humility I would display even so. It was delusion beyond delusion. I was dying, but like Schubert, I cared only about the next inch. Yeah, finally to the end of it. The oxygen ran dry as the sun broke. My headlamp had grown feeble anyway, frosted with ice and with its battery crippled by the freezing temperatures. This was my last sunrise, I was fairly sure, cutting through the shark's teeth of peaks that ran the breadth of this alien continent. The dull red glow was empowering with its illusion of warmth. Once that large foreign star lifted its chin above the most distant of snow-capped crowns, it seemed to rise with a vengeance. It made a mockery of my own agonizing ascent. It occurred to me in the wan light of dawn that I was the highest man in the universe. Coughing into my mask, I couldn't feel my legs, but I could at least balance on them. The handful, not quite, of fingers and toes I had left would be gone, but that was optimistic. I could see the summit up the ridgeline. There was no more technical climbing, no ice to work up, no faces or craggy steps, just a long walk on unfeeling stumps. A walk to a grave that stood far over all mortal heads. I found myself on my knees without remembering falling. The snow was thin here. It blew off sideways and was just as soon replaced. There would be no flags ahead, no weather stations, no books to scribble in, no webcams showing a high sunrise to millions of net surfers. It was just a lonely and quiet peak, not a footstep, not ever. Untrampled earth, a thing that had grown exceedingly rare. The people of Eno had their own name for Mallory. Locals always did. It translated to unconquerable, but of course nothing ever was. It was always a matter of time, of the right gear, the right support teams, all the ladders and lines and camps and barrels put in by hardworking Sherpas. I was on my hands and knees, mask howling, lightheaded and half sane, crawling toward my destiny. And I missed Hansen. I wanted him there. I missed him more than my wife and kids, who I would never see again. There was my grave up ahead, a bare patch of rock where snow danced like smoke, like running water, like angels in lace dresses. I wondered if my body would lie there forever, or if the wind would eventually shove me off. I wondered this as I reached the summit, dragging myself along, my suit giving up the last of its juice. Collapsing there, lying on my belly, I watched the sun rise through my mask. And when it frosted over and my coughing grew so severe, I worried those were flecks of purple lungs spotting my vision. I accepted my death by pulling the mask free to watch this last sunrise, this highest and most magnificent sunrise with my very own eyes. I'm not gonna have time for the last 3 pages, but I think it ends right there. And dying, it doesn't. So. So again,
Next cliffhanger.
Yeah. I wish I could like go to another room and finish reading it for you.
Good pot to get us to my ear.
Well, it's between 99 cents. It's a Kindle single, and I'm really excited that they included it. For those of you here to hear Patrick, he should be coming in and reading it.
What's the title of the book?
The Walk Up Nameless Ridge, and you can Google is your friend, so.
When will it be out?
And how did you get down?
Hugh, when will it be out?
They're trying to get it published next week, so Mike Gaber's working on the cover art right now. This all happened yesterday.
So, but I mean, early week, midweek, when should people watch for it?
Amazon, I can spoil this now because it's in the front page of the Wall Street Journal. Amazon's got a press conference on Thursday, and they're flying me out for it. So, in Santa Monica, I think they're announcing some new gadgets.
So what have you climbed?
I haven't.
You haven't?
Authors make stuff up. Some of it's worse. Long childhood line of my parents.
That never happened.
What's that?
That never happened.